No, answered Michel, he is dead. There, added he in a piteous tone, that is embarrassing, I much fear, my poor Diana, that you will leave no progeny in the lunar regions. Indeed, the unfortunate satellite had not survived its wound. It was quite dead. Michel Ardan looked at his friends with a rueful countenance. One question presents itself, said Barbicane. We cannot keep the dead body of this dog with us for the next 48 hours. No, certainly not, replied Nicholl. But our scuttles are fixed on hinges, they can be let down. We will open one, and throw the body out into space. The president thought for some moments, and then said, Yes, we must do so, but at the same time taking very great precautions. Why? Asked Michel. For two reasons, which you will understand, answered Barbicane. The first relates to the air shut up in the projectile, and of which we must lose as little as possible. But we manufacture the air. Only in part, we make only the oxygen, my worthy Michel. And with regard to that, we must watch that the apparatus does not furnish the oxygen into great a quantity. For an excess would bring us very serious physiological troubles. But if we make the oxygen, we do not make the azote, that medium which the lungs do not absorb, and which ought to remain intact. And that azote will escape rapidly, through the open scuttles. Oh, the time for throwing out poor satellite, said Michel. Agreed, but we must act quickly. And the second reason, asked Michel. The second reason is that we must not let the outer cold, which is excessive, penetrate the projectile, or we shall be frozen to death. But the sun warms our projectile, which absorbs its rays. But it does not warm the vacuum, in which we are floating at this moment. Where there is no air, there is no more heat than diffused light. And the same with darkness, it is cold. Where the sun's rays do not strike direct, this temperature is only the temperature produced by the radiation of the stars. That is to say, what the terrestrial globe would undergo, if the sun disappeared one day. Which is not to be feared, replied Nicholl. Who knows, said Michel Ardan, but, in admitting that the sun does not go out, might it not happen that the earth might move away from it? There, said Barbicane, there is Michel with his ideas. And, continued Michel, do we not know that in 1861, the earth passed through the tail of a comet? Or let us suppose a comet, whose power of attraction is greater than that of the sun. The terrestrial orbit will bend toward the wandering star, and the earth, becoming its satellite, will be drawn such a distance that the rays of the sun will have no action on its surface. That might happen, indeed, replied Barbicane, but the consequences of such a displacement need not be so formidable as you suppose. And why not? Because the heat and cold would be equalized on our globe. It has been calculated that, had our Earth been carried along in its course, by the comet of 1861, at its perihelion, that is, its nearest approach to the Sun, it would have undergone a heat 28,000 times greater than that of summer, but this heat, which is sufficient to evaporate the waters, would have formed a thick ring of cloud, which would have modified that excessive temperature. Hence the compensation between the cold of the aphelion and the heat of the perihelion. At how many degrees, asked Nicholl, is the temperature of the planetary spaces estimated? Formerly, replied Barbicane, it was greatly exaggerated. But now, after the calculations of Freer, of the French Academy of Science, It is not supposed to exceed 60 centigrade below zero. Who, said Michel, that's nothing. It is very much, replied Barbicane. The temperature which was observed in the polar regions, at Melville Island and Fort Reliance, that is 76 Fahrenheit below zero. If I mistake not, said Nicole, M. Quillet, another savant, estimates the temperature of space at 250 Fahrenheit below zero. We shall, however, be able to verify these calculations for ourselves. Not at present, because the solar rays, beating directly upon our thermometer, would give, on the contrary, a very high temperature, but when we arrive in the moon, during its 15 days of night at either face, we shall have leisure to make the experiment, for our satellite lies in a vacuum. What do you mean by a vacuum? Asked Michel. Is it perfectly such? It is absolutely void of air. And is the air replaced by nothing whatever? By the ether only, replied Barbicane. And pray what is the ether? The ether, my friend, is an agglomeration of imponderable atoms, which, relatively to their dimensions, are as far removed from each other as the celestial bodies are in space. It is these atoms which, by their vibratory motion, produce both light and heat in the universe. They now proceeded to the burial of Satellite. They had merely to drop him into space, in the same way that sailors drop a body into the sea. But, as President Barbicane suggested, they must act quickly, so as to lose as little as possible of that air, whose elasticity would rapidly have spread it into space. The bolts of the right scuttle, the opening of which measured about 12 inches across, were carefully drawn, while Michel, quite grieved, prepared to launch his dog into space. The glass, raised by a powerful lever, which enabled it to overcome the pressure of the inside air on the walls of the projectile, turned rapidly on its hinges, and Satellite was thrown out. Scarcely a particle of air could have escaped, and the operation was so successful that later on Barbicane did not fear to dispose of the rubbish which encumbered the car. Chapter 6. Question A and D. Answer. On the 4th of December, when the travelers awoke after 54 hours' journey, the chronometer marked 5 o'clock of the terrestrial morning. In time, it was just over 5 hours and 40 minutes, half of that assigned to their sojourn in the projectile, but they had already accomplished nearly 7/10 of the way. This peculiarity was due to their regularly decreasing speed. Now, when they observed the Earth through the lower window, it looked like nothing more than a dark spot, drowned in the solar rays. No more crescent, no more cloudy light. The next day, at midnight, the Earth would be new. At the very moment when the moon would be full above, the orb of night was nearing the line followed by the projectile, so as to meet it at the given hour. All around the black vault was studded with brilliant points, which seemed to move slowly. But, at the great distance they were from them, their relative size did not seem to change. The sun and stars appeared exactly as they do to us upon Earth. As to the moon, she was considerably larger. But the travelers' glasses, not very powerful, did not allow them as yet to make any useful observations upon her surface, or reconnoiter her topographically or geologically. Thus the time passed in never-ending conversations, all about the moon. Each one brought forward his own contingent of particular facts. Barbicane and Nicole always serious, Michel Ardan always enthusiastic. The projectile, its situation, its direction, incidents which might happen, the precautions necessitated by their fall onto the moon, were inexhaustible matters of conjecture. As they were breakfasting, a question of Michel's, relating to the projectile, provoked rather a curious answer from Barbicane, which is worth repeating. Michel, supposing it to be roughly stopped, while still under its formidable initial speed, wished to know what the consequences of the stoppage would have been. But, said Barbicane, I do not see how it could have been stopped. But let us suppose so, said Michel. It is an impossible supposition, said the practical Barbicane. Unless that impulsive force had failed, but even then its speed would diminish by degrees, and it would not have stopped suddenly. Admit that it had struck a body in space. What body? Why, that enormous meteor, which we met. Then, said Nicholl, the projectile would have been broken into 1,000 pieces, and we with it. More than that, replied Barbicane, we should have been burned to death. Burned, exclaimed Michel, by Jove. I am sorry it did not happen, just to see. And you would have seen, replied Barbicane. It is known now that heat is only a modification of motion. When water is warmed, that is to say, when heat is added to it, its particles are set in motion. Well, said Michel, that is an ingenious theory. And a true one, my worthy friend. For it explains every phenomenon of caloric. Heat is but the motion of atoms, a simple oscillation of the particles of a body. When they apply the brake to a train, the train comes to a stop. But what becomes of the motion, which it had previously possessed? It is transformed into heat, and the brake becomes hot. Why do they grease the axles of the wheels? To prevent their heating, because this heat would be generated by the motion, which is thus lost by transformation. Yes, I understand, replied Michel, perfectly. For example, when I have run a long time, when I am swimming, when I am perspiring in large drops, why am I obliged to stop? Simply because my motion is changed into heat. Barbicane could not help smiling at Michel's reply. Then, returning to his theory, said, thus, in case of a shock, it would have been with our projectile, as with a ball, which falls in a burning state after having struck the metal plate. It is its motion, which is turned into heat. Consequently, I affirm that, if our projectile had struck the meteor, its speed thus suddenly checked would have raised a heat great enough to turn it into vapor instantaneously. Then, asked Nicholl, what would happen if the Earth's motion were to stop suddenly? Her temperature would be raised to such a pitch, said Barbicane, that she would be at once reduced to vapor. Well, said Michel, that is a way of ending the Earth, which will greatly simplify things. And if the Earth fell upon the Sun? Asked Nicholl. According to calculation, replied Barbicane, the fall would develop a heat equal to that produced by 16,000 globes of coal, each equal in bulk to our terrestrial globe. Good additional heat for the Sun, replied Michel Ardan, of which the inhabitants of Uranus or Neptune would doubtless not complain. They must be perished with cold on their planets. Thus, my friends, said Barbicane, all motion suddenly stopped produces heat, and this theory allows us to infer that the heat of the solar disk is fed by a hail of meteors falling incessantly on its surface. They have even calculated. Oh, dear, murmured Michel, the figures are coming. They have even calculated, continued the imperturbable Barbicane, that the shock of each meteor on the Sun ought to produce a heat equal to that of 4,000 masses of coal of an equal bulk. And what is the solar heat? Asked Michel. It is equal to that produced by the combustion of a stratum of coal, surrounding the Sun to a depth of 47 miles, and that heat would be able to boil to 900 billion of cubic myriameters of water. The myriameter is equal to rather more than 10,936 cubic yards, English. And it does not roast us, exclaimed Michel. No, replied Barbicane, because the terrestrial atmosphere absorbs 4/10 of the solar heat. Besides, the quantity of heat intercepted by the Earth is but a billionth part of the entire radiation. I see that all is for the best, said Michel, and that this atmosphere is a useful invention. For it not only allows us to breathe, but it prevents us from roasting. Yes, said Nicole, unfortunately, it will not be the same in the moon. But, said Michel, always hopeful, if there are inhabitants, they must breathe. If there are no longer any, they must have left enough oxygen for 3 people, if only at the bottom of ravines, where its own weight will cause it to accumulate, and we will not climb the mountains. That is all, and Michel, rising, went to look at the lunar disk, which shone with intolerable brilliancy. By Jove, said he, it must be hot up there. Without considering, replied Nicole, that the day lasts 360 hours. And to compensate that, said Barbicane, the nights have the same length. And as heat is restored by radiation, their temperature can only be that of the planetary space. A pretty country, that, exclaimed Michel, never mind. I wish I was there, all my dear comrades. It will be rather curious to have the Earth for our moon, to see it rise on the horizon, to recognize the shape of its continents, and to say to oneself, there is America, there is Europe. Then to follow it, when it is about to lose itself in the sun's rays. By the by, Barbicane, have the Selenites eclipses? Yes, eclipses of the sun, replied Barbicane, when the centers of the 3 orbs are on a line, the Earth being in the middle, but they are only partial, during which the Earth, cast like a screen upon the solar disk, allows the greater portion to be seen. And why, asked Nicole, is there no total eclipse? Does not the cone of the shadow cast by the Earth extend beyond the moon? Yes, if we do not take into consideration the refraction produced by the terrestrial atmosphere. No, if we take that refraction into consideration, thus let u lowercase delta diu be the horizontal parallel and p the apparent semidiameter. Oh, said Michel, do speak plainly, you man of algebra. Very well, replied Barbicane, in popular language the mean distance from the moon to the Earth being 60 terrestrial radii, the length of the cone of the shadow, on account of refraction, is reduced to less than 42 radii. The result is that, when there are eclipses, the moon finds itself beyond the cone of pure shadow, and that the sun sends her its rays, not only from its edges, but also from its center. Then, said Michel in a merry tone, why are there eclipses, when there ought not to be any? Simply because the solar rays are weakened by this refraction, and the atmosphere through which they pass extinguished the greater part of them. That reason satisfies me, replied Michel. Besides, we shall see, when we get there. Now, tell me, Barbicane, do you believe that the moon is an old comet? There's an idea. Yes, replied Michel, with an amiable swagger, I have a few ideas of that sort. But that idea does not spring from Michel, answered Nicole. Well, then, I am a plagiarist. No doubt about it, according to the ancients, the Arcadians pretend that their ancestors inhabited the Earth before the moon became her satellite. Starting from this fact, some scientific men have seen in the moon a comet whose orbit will one day bring it so near to the Earth that it will be held there by its attraction. Is there any truth in this hypothesis? Asked Michel. None whatever, said Barbicane, and the proof is that the moon has preserved no trace of the gaseous envelope which always accompanies comets. But, continued Nicole, before becoming the Earth's satellite, could not the moon, when in her perihelion, pass so near the sun as by evaporation, to get rid of all those gaseous substances? It is possible, friend Nicole, but not probable. Why not? Because of faith I do not know. Ah, exclaimed Michel, what hundred of volumes we might make of all that we do not know. Ah, indeed, what time is it? Asked Barbicane. 3 o'clock, answered Nicole. How time goes, said Michel, in the conversation of scientific men, such as we are. Certainly, I feel I know too much, I feel that I am becoming a well. Saying which, Michel hoisted himself to the roof of the projectile, to observe the moon better. He pretended, during this time his companions were watching through the lower glass, nothing new to note. When Michel Ardan came down, he went to the side scuttle, and suddenly they heard an exclamation of surprise. What is it? Asked Barbicane. The president approached the window, and saw a sort of flattened sack, floating some yards from the projectile. This object seemed as motionless as the projectile, and was consequently animated with the same ascending movement. What is that machine? Continued Michel Ardan. Is it one of the bodies, which our projectile keeps within its attraction, and which will accompany it to the moon? What astonishes me, said Nicole, is that the specific weight of the body, which is certainly less than that of the projectile, allows it to keep so perfectly on a level with it. Nicole, replied Barbicane, after a moment's reflection, I do not know what the object is, but I do know why it maintains our level. And why? Because we are floating in space, my dear Captain, and in space bodies fall or move, which is the same thing, with equal speed, whatever be their weight or form. It is the air, which by its resistance creates these differences in weight. When you create a vacuum in a tube, the objects you send through it, grains of dust or grains of lead, fall with the same rapidity. Here in space is the same cause and the same effect. Just so, said Nicole, and everything we throw out of the projectile will accompany it until it reaches the moon. Ah, fools that we are, exclaimed Michel. Why that expletive? Asked Barbicane. Because we might have filled the projectile with useful objects, books, instruments, tools, etc., we could have thrown them all out, and all would have followed in our train. But happy thought! Why cannot we walk outside like the meteor? Why cannot we launch into space through the scuttle? What enjoyment it would be to feel oneself thus suspended in ether, more favored than the birds, who must use their wings to keep themselves up. Granted, said Barbicane, but how to breathe? Hang the air, to fail so inopportunely? But if it did not fail, Michel, your density being less than that of the projectile, you would soon be left behind. Then we must remain in our car. We must. Ah, exclaimed Michel in a low voice. What is the matter? Asked Nicole. I know, I guess, what this pretended meteor is. It is no asteroid which is accompanying us, It is not a piece of a planet. What is it then? Asked Barbicane. It is our unfortunate doll. It is Diana's husband. Indeed, this deformed, unrecognizable object, reduced to nothing, was the body of Satellite, flattened like a bagpipe without wind, and ever mounting. Chapter 7. A moment of intoxication. Thus a phenomenon, curious but explicable, was happening under these strange conditions. Every object thrown from the projectile would follow the same course and never stop until it did. There was a subject for conversation, which the whole evening could not exhaust. Besides, the excitement of the three travelers increased as they drew near the end of their journey. They expected unforeseen incidents and new phenomena, and nothing would have astonished them in the frame of mind they then were in. Their overexcited imagination went faster than the projectile, whose speed was evidently diminishing, though insensibly to themselves, but the moon grew larger to their eyes, and they fancied, if they stretched out their hands, they could seize it. The next day, the 5th of November, at 5 in the morning, all three were on foot. That day was to be the last of their journey, if all calculations were true. That very night, at 12 o'clock in 18 hours, exactly at the full moon, they would reach its brilliant disk. The next midnight would see that journey ended. The most extraordinary of ancient or modern times. Thus from the first of the morning, through the scuttles silvered by its rays, they saluted the orb of night with a confident and joyous hurrah. The moon was advancing majestically along the starry firmament a few more degrees, and she would reach the exact point where her meeting with the projectile was to take place. According to his own observations, Barbicane reckoned that they would land on her northern hemisphere, where stretch immense plains, and where mountains are rare, a favorable circumstance if, as they thought, the lunar atmosphere was stored only in its depths. Besides, observed Michel Ardan, a plain is easier to disembark upon than a mountain. A selenite, deposited in Europe on the summit of Mont Blanc, or in Asia on the top of the Himalayas, would not be quite in the right place. And, added Captain Nicholl, on a flat ground, the projectile will remain motionless when it has once touched, whereas on a declivity, it would roll like an avalanche, and not being squirrels, we should not come out safe and sound, so it is all for the best. Indeed, the success of the audacious attempt no longer appeared doubtful, but Barbicane was preoccupied with one thought. But not wishing to make his companions uneasy, he kept silence on this subject. The direction the projectile was taking toward the moon's northern hemisphere showed that her course had been slightly altered. The discharge, mathematically calculated, would carry the projectile to the very center of the lunar disk. If it did not land there, there must have been some deviation. What had caused it? Barbicane could neither imagine nor determine the importance of the deviation, for there were no points to go by. He hoped, however, that it would have no other result than that of bringing them nearer the upper border of the moon, a region more suitable for landing. Without imparting his uneasiness to his companions, Barbicane contented himself with constantly observing the moon, in order to see whether the course of the projectile would not be altered, for the situation would have been terrible if it failed in its aim, and being carried beyond the disk, should be launched into interplanetary space. At that moment, the moon, instead of appearing flat like a disk, showed its convexity. If the sun's rays had struck it obliquely, the shadow thrown would have brought out the high mountains, which would have been clearly detached. The eye might have gazed into the crater's gaping abysses, and followed the capricious fissures which wound through the immense plains, but all relief was as yet leveled in intense brilliancy. They could scarcely distinguish those large spots, which give the moon the appearance of a human face. Face, indeed, said Michel Ardan, but I am sorry for the amiable sister of Apollo, a very pitted face. But the travelers, now so near the end, were incessantly observing this new world. They imagined themselves walking through its unknown countries, climbing its highest peaks, descending into its lowest depths. Here and there they fancied they saw vast seas, scarcely kept together under so rarefied an atmosphere, and water courses emptying the mountain tributaries, leaning over the abyss. They hoped to catch some sounds from that orb forever mute, in the solitude of space, that last day left them. They took down the most trifling details. A vague uneasiness took possession of them. As they neared the end, this uneasiness would have been doubled had they felt how their speed had decreased. It would have seemed to them quite insufficient to carry them to the end. It was because the projectile then weighed almost nothing, its weight was ever decreasing, and would be entirely annihilated on that line, where the lunar and terrestrial attractions would neutralize each other. But in spite of his preoccupation, Michel Ardan did not forget to prepare the morning repast with his accustomed punctuality. They ate with a good appetite. Nothing was so excellent as the soup liquefied by the heat of the gas. Nothing better than the preserved meat. Some glasses of good French wine crowned the repast, causing Michel Ardan to remark that the lunar vines, warmed by that ardent sun, ought to distill even more generous wines. That is, if they existed. In any case, the far-seeing Frenchman had taken care not to forget in his collection some precious cuttings of the Medoc and Côte d'Or upon which he founded his hopes. Risset and Regnaut's apparatus worked with great regularity. Not an atom of carbonic acid resisted the potash. And as to the oxygen, Captain Nicholl said it was of the first quality. The little watery vapor enclosed in the projectile mixing with the air tempered the dryness. And many apartments in London, Paris, or New York, and many theaters, were certainly not in such a healthy condition. But that it might act with regularity, the apparatus must be kept in perfect order. So each morning Michel visited the escape regulators, tried the taps, and regulated the heat of the gas by the pyrometer. Everything had gone well up to that time, and the travelers, imitating the worthy Joseph T. Maston, began to acquire a degree of embonpoint which would have rendered them unrecognizable if their imprisonment had been prolonged to some months. In a word, they behaved like chickens in a coop. They were getting fat. In looking through the scuttle, Barbicane saw the specter of the dog and other divers objects, which had been thrown from the projectile, obstinately following them. Diana howled lugubriously on seeing the remains of satellite, which seemed as motionless as if they reposed on solid earth. "Do you know, my friends," said Michel Ardan, "that if one of us had succumbed to the shock consequent on departure, we should have had a great deal of trouble to bury him. What am I saying? To etherize him, as here ether takes the place of earth. You see, the accusing body would have followed us into space like a remorse." "That would have been sad," said Nicholl. "Well," continued Michel, "what I regret is not being able to take a walk outside. What voluptuousness to float amid this radiant ether, to bathe oneself in it, to wrap oneself in the sun's pure rays. If Barbicane had only thought of furnishing us with a diving apparatus and an air pump, I could have ventured out and assumed fanciful attitudes of feigned monsters on the top of the projectile." "Well, old Michel," replied Barbicane. You would not have made a feigned monster long, for in spite of your diver's dress, swollen by the expansion of air within you, you would have burst like a shell, or rather like a balloon, which has risen too high. So do not regret it, and do not forget thrice as long as we float in space. All sentimental walks beyond the projectile are forbidden. Michel Ardan allowed himself to be convinced to a certain extent. He admitted that the thing was difficult but not impossible, a word which he never uttered. The conversation passed from this subject to another, not failing him for an instant. It seemed to the three friends as though, under present conditions, ideas shot up in their brains. As leaves shoot at the first warmth of spring, they felt bewildered in the middle of the questions and answers, which crossed each other. Nicholl put one question, which did not find an immediate solution. "Ah, indeed," said he, "it is all very well to go to the moon, but how to get back again?" His two interlocutors looked surprised. One would have thought that this possibility now occurred to them for the first time. "What do you mean by that, Nicholl?" asked Barbicane gravely. "To ask for means to leave a country," added Michel, "when we have not yet arrived there, seems to me rather inopportune." "I do not say that, wishing to draw back," replied Nicholl. "But I repeat my question, and I ask, how shall we return?" "I know nothing about it," answered Barbicane. "And I," said Michel, "if I had known how to return, I would never have started." "There's an answer," cried Nicholl. "I quite approve of Michel's words," said Barbicane. "And add that the question has no real interest later. When we think it is advisable to return, we will take counsel together. If the Columbiad is not there, the projectile will be. That is a step certainly, a ball without a gun." "The gun," replied Barbicane, "can be manufactured, the powder can be made, neither metals, saltpeter, nor coal can fail in the depths of the moon, and we need only go 8,000 leagues, in order to fall upon the terrestrial globe, by virtue of the mere laws of weight." "Enough," said Michel with animation. "Let it be no longer a question of returning. We have already entertained it too long, as to communicating with our former earthly colleagues. That will not be difficult." "And how?" "By means of meteors launched by lunar volcanoes." "Well thought of, Michel," said Barbicane in a convinced tone of voice. "Laplace has calculated that a force 5 times greater than that of our gun would suffice to send a meteor from the moon to the earth, and there is not one volcano which has not a greater power of propulsion than that." "Hurrah!" exclaimed Michel. "These meteors are handy postmen, and cost nothing, and how we shall be able to laugh at the post office administration. But now I think of it. What do you think of a capital idea? Why did we not fasten a thread to our projectile, and we could have exchanged telegrams with the earth?" "The deuce," answered Nicholl. "Do you consider the weight of a thread? 250,000 miles long nothing."